Good afternoon, all. We'll give a few minutes for everyone to trickle into the Zoom room before we start today's panel. My name is Lisa Placanica. I'm the Senior Managing Director for the Center for Technology of Licensing at the Weill Cornell Medicine campus, which is the Medical College of Cornell University. CTL is responsible for the intellectual property and commercialization partnerships for all technologies developed by university and medical college faculty and trainees. CTL at Weill Cornell Medicine is actually part of a larger group called Weill Cornell Medicine Enterprise Innovation that provides education, programming, training, mentorship to innovators who are interested in the commercialization journey. Today, we have our next installment of our special panels series, which is special panels we convene covering a variety of topics that are germane to healthcare innovation, commercialization, and entrepreneurship. The special panel series actually started and was conceived around digital health technologies in 2021. Like many colleges and universities, we have a growing increase in activity in research in digital health technologies and their applications in healthcare innovation. We thought today it was good to cover healthcare data, which really underlies the development of digital health technologies. And really, why is it so hard to commercialize, and what are the paths to doing so that are ethically responsible and legal, as well as what is the value of the healthcare data that we have. You can ask questions using the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. We'll try to address those at the end of the panel discussion today. Also, at the end of the panel, you'll receive a questionnaire. We'd appreciate it if you can take a few minutes to fill that out so we can build content that better meets the needs of our audience. With that, I would like to welcome our panelists, and they'll provide a brief introduction, and then we'll dive into the discussions. I'd like to start with Kurt Cole.
Hi, I'm Kurt Cole. I am the Chief Global Information Officer for Cornell University.
Devin?
I'm Devin McGraw. I'm the lead for data stewardship and data sharing at Invitae. Came to Invitae because of its acquisition of a patient-facing data platform that I co-founded called Citizen. And prior to co-founding Citizen, I was the HIPAA regulator at HHS and the acting chief privacy officer at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Roger?
Hi, my name is Roger Kwan. I'm a partner out of Norton Rose Fulbright's San Francisco office and the U.S. head of the digital health and precision medicine practice.
And Jason.
Hi, my name is Jason Novak. I'm also a partner at the San Francisco office, a practice partner of Roger Kwan in the Precision Medicine and Digital Health Practice Groups, former in-house counsel Thermo Fisher, along with Roger Kwan is where we met each other and started our practice 6 years ago.
Great, thank you. So today's discussion, I think, falls upon three sort of main buckets of topics that we'd like to touch upon. One is policies and best practices, privacy and access issues, and value creation and intellectual property matters. So I'd like to open it up with a question to Kurt. So as a global university and a prominent academic medical center, what are some of the key policies and best practices that address the mission of the institution, but also support innovation and provide commercial access to healthcare information?
Thanks for that question. I recently wrote a paper with several colleagues from other major academic medical centers throughout the country, where we outlined 10 principles for how you can use clinical data for research and commercialization within an ethical framework. And I won't go through all of them in detail, but the basic concept to keep in mind is that patients come to us for care. Now, they come to academic medical centers knowing that our care is research informed. So the idea that their data is going to be used in research is pretty much embedded into the understanding of patients. However, I don't think most patients come even to an academic medical center thinking that we are going to then sell their data to make money, even if that money is going to be used to support the other missions of the institution. So the question then is, how do you finance, or how do you have financial transactions that use this data, which is increasingly essential to the kinds of research that we do, whether it's building algorithms or whatever. And I think there are a lot of analogies to clinical trials where we're working with commercial entities that will ultimately make a profit, but they are developing things that save lives and improve life. So first principles in medicine, what is it? Primum non nocere, first do no harm. That is our ethos, not a Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things. And we need to stick to that first do no harm. So the most important principle is that we don't sell data, period. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be a financial transaction, which is that we can be paid to do academic work. And that's what we do in the context of a clinical trial. And then the other principles are relatively common sense and are relatively established in HIPAA frameworks and others. You have to use the minimum amount of data that's necessary to do the job. You should limit your contracts to include only the necessary work. And if you're going to change the scope of work, you have to revisit what you're going to be doing with the data. You don't give over rights to the data. You don't transfer ownership of the data. You have to manage your financial conflicts, and you need to be transparent in everything that you do. And you have to have oversight analogous to an IRB, again, for a clinical trial, to make sure that we are staying within these ethical frameworks. Now, these are principles, and they don't always work for every single specific transaction. Sometimes the data you can't, for example, one of the principles would be you should be able to claw the data back. And if the data has already been embedded in an algorithm, you can't necessarily do that. So you have to work around frameworks of these principles and mitigate to try to stick to the core principle of not doing harm.
Great. Thank you for that good overview of setting sort of guiding principles. Devin, I'd like to turn to you. I love that your title is data stewardship. I think, that's such an important word. It very much resonates with me. Can you talk a little bit about the role of the private sector versus the public sector and really, championing these policies and these protections for patients? And do patients have a role in this themselves?
Yeah, I mean, those are really good questions. And I'm really pleased to follow on from Kurt's most excellent set of principles around how this is done, because this is definitely, the goal should be a trusted ecosystem for data sharing. And the regulatory framework is the baseline for that. Like, nobody can fall below what the rules require, but the rules are, if you're using de-identified data, for example, data that's de-identified in accordance with HIPAA standards, there's actually very few regulatory hurdles to data use and data sharing. And oftentimes I've seen it, I've seen companies say, well, the data is de-identified, so you don't need to worry about it. But the reality is that it is increasingly not enough if the outcome that you are trying to achieve is that the public understands and trusts what you're doing with your data, because there are consequences to that. There may not be legal consequences if you've appropriately de-identified the data, because again, we sort of take this view from a regulatory standpoint, it's kind of hands off if you've properly de-identified the data, but you will be still answerable to your stakeholders, the community you're serving, as well as the public, if you're kind of falling down on some of the more ethical components. And to me, that's where the private sector really comes into play, and where a set of best practices that are quite aligned with what Kurt just talked about are critically important. Having ethical review of data uses, not, essentially not necessarily taking all comers in terms of people who want to access your data. What is the purpose for which they're accessing it? And is it consistent with the mission of your organization and what patients would reasonably expect would happen to their data? Are you transparent? Not through just a HIPAA notice of privacy practices, because that just says what you have the right to do with data, but doesn't actually tell people what you're actually doing with data. At Invitae, we issued a data use and transparency report where we went through every single user of our data from internal to third parties and put it out in a report to the public about how we were essentially leveraging the data that they entrusted to us through genetic testing and through the platform that we offer for patients to gather their data in order to advance precision medicine, which is what we do as a precision medicine company. We think that that's a trust building exercise to put that out there, in addition to, IRB review and an internal data ethics board. And I think increasingly there are a number of sort of similar sets of principles and practices that are sort of popping up in different sectors across the data ecosystem, but not universally. I mean, I really think that what Kurt has done is exemplary and not necessarily followed universally. So I think there's room for other companies to sort of step up, because I also worry that we are pulled down by the lowest common denominator, right? If somebody else misuses data, it creates a black mark across all of it. And in terms of the role of patients, like, I think it is actually, we have a patient advocate on our data review board, and we do return some of the value that we get out of commercial licensing of consented data to patients. It's a little tricky with fraud and abuse and Stark laws sometimes to figure out a way to do that, but we do think that the value that we are gleaning from the data gets returned to the patient, not just in the form of the services that we deliver, but in terms of just pure commercial value, because they take on risk by allowing us to use their data, even if we've de-risked it, but through de-identification.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, about Devin, for those that might not be familiar with like the Stark law and the things you referenced, and also what sort of kind of model you use to share that value back with the patients?
Yeah, we quite frankly, an anti-kickback law would preclude you from providing something of benefit to a patient in exchange for a service for which you're being paid. So on the genetic testing side of our company, it's a little bit challenging if we license de-identified genetic data consistent with our patient preferences, which we do allow patient's choice as well. Then ideally we would be able to return some of that value directly to the patient, not just in the form of a lower, in whatever form it would be. But it's a little, you have to think about, you're providing a monetary benefit to a patient who has received a genetic test from you. It gets a little bit tricky there, but we've been able to sort of share value through our voluntary citizen platform, which again is the platform that patients can voluntarily adopt to use to gather all their health information, put it under their control, and be able to share it as they see fit. And because that's disconnected from the test ordering process, it gives us a little bit more freedom in terms of providing something of value to patients who have come along with us in the support of a research enterprise that does involve licensing fees for data that came from their care.
Great, thank you for that. I think I'll turn to Jason and Roger next. So, I think one of the themes I've heard is that there's legal, and then there's maybe a different standard that an academic medical center or a healthcare provider would want to think about when they're providing data or access to data. And Kurt kind of referenced the difference between we're not Silicon Valley who's going fast and breaking things. We are, we do no harm, and we're a medical institution first and foremost. Can you talk a little bit about how some of maybe these additional policies or practices that are implemented by an academic medical center may or may not impact the ultimate quote value of the data? I think that's, what should somebody be aware of, and what are some policies that could either increase or decrease the value of the data?
Great. I mean, on the legal side, I'm going to echo a lot of things that Devin and Curtis already brought up. I mean, really, the messaging that we give our clients is be proactive and plan ahead. I mean, that's really the general message. From a commercial perspective, the issues that we're spotting and we help our clients deal with is primarily on the regulatory as well as the data rights side, right? So on the regulatory side, some of the stuff that Devin just brought up, HIPAA obviously is a very big issue, as well as the Stark anti-kickback laws, as well as what's cropping up right now and bubbling up in the US is there's a lot of state-specific data privacy laws. That is something that everyone really need to keep a really close eye on. There's 5 states as of today that have enacted these type of legislation, and probably another 4 that's pretty close to doing it probably by the end of next year. So that's going to really complicate, especially on the privacy side, the regulatory environment. On the rights piece of it, Curtis brought some of that up. I mean, the primary use is, generally speaking, I think the entities are pretty good about getting rights to primary use of data. It's the secondary use of data that gets complicated. Meaning, so a good example of that secondary use would be what's happened with companies like 23andMe, right? They are at least on the surface, a genealogy company. But really, if you look at their underlying business model, it's really based on, again, transacting that data to secondary users, such as big pharma and biopharma. And I think what's happened, if you take that as an example, folks who have used 23andMe in the past, you probably have seen a lot of inundation in your email box about asking whether or not you want to participate in medical research, et cetera, right? That's because I don't think they did a very good job planning ahead of making sure those rights were secured right from the start. So again, plan and be proactive. On the IP side, what we're seeing right now is there's been a lot of confusion over the last 5-6 years around whether or not diagnostics and data science type of inventions that are rising out of this data use is actually even patentable in the US. That confusion, by and large, was caused by a lot of case law that rolled across the Supreme Court. But what we're seeing in the last 3 or 4 years is that these weird, seemingly very, very unfavorable stances that the U.S. legal system has taken to these inventions has softened over the last 3 or 4 years. And so right now, I think the thing that to keep in mind, especially for companies, even universities that are in this space, is that these inventions are arising out of these insights or generated out of data is fairly broadly patentable. I mean, it's pretty surprising, especially in the last couple of years. And Jason and I have taken a pretty close look at, we've been peeking a tab on the type of patents are issued, and surprisingly broad, right, Jason?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think something to keep in mind as well is that, and we think about IP and data, the use of data is what forms your IP. So at the end of the day, if you're analyzing your data and training new AI machine learning models, it's to derive insights. Those insights ends up what's being patentable. So a data strategy is actually more important chronologically than an IP strategy, because you can't have one unless your data is appropriately protected, appropriately secured, appropriately tracked and mapped, making sure there's proper and verifiable consent practice and whatnot. So you have real line of sight to what your data actually has, and other folks who may want to engage in that data also have clear line of sight. And I think sometimes what folks, and Roger and I talk about the ready, fire, aim versus ready, aim, fire. It never more applies to data strategy. If you try to put the genie back in the bottle after you've failed to get the appropriate rights, or failed to realize that some of the data we're using was for research use purposes only, and not commercial rights, and things like that, going back and trying to get those rights, or going, the way 23andMe had to do it, they had to go back to each individual customer. Well, if you have to go back to an entity to get those rights, they're going to get another pound of flesh from you, and it starts to weigh on the actual value proposition of what you're trying to generate out of that data.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. Going back on the transaction species of this, right? We in legal have this tendency to rely on indemnification clauses in our transactions, in these agreements, right? They're helpful in certain settings, they're not helpful in others. One thing that we need to be very aware of is that if, for example, you're using data to go ahead and pump out a commercial product, right? No manner of indemnification clause will help you if that you have to go ahead and later on extract that data out of your product that has gone through full FDA approval, right? Because you got to pull the product from market. So the indemnification clauses won't really protect you in that type of situation. You really absolutely need to account for these things up front. Again, plan and be proactive.
I'd like to follow up with Jason a little bit on what we were saying also on sort of this. The data underlies the ultimate innovation or product, really. Like the data itself is not the product, but what are some things that either innovators or entrepreneurs, or for those like me who are working on that interface between kind of academic commercialization, need to think about when we're trying to commercialize the digital health innovation and the underlying data? What are some of the things we need to proactively put in place first to make sure that we have the full rights to transfer the digital health innovation? Or what access to the underlying data would a commercial entity need? What are some of the things that we just need to be thinking about proactively?
I think it starts with mapping the life cycle of that data. What I mean by that is placing yourself in the center of a chart, and where's data coming in and where's data going out, and what are those sources, and within each of those lines, making sure each one of those lines aren't broken, make sure that consent is proper between those lines, whether data is coming in or data is going out, whether you need to have the consent or the entities that are providing you data have the proper consents from their patients, making sure that is clean, making sure that you have the appropriate, particularly if you're a PI in a research institute that is grabbing data from multiple resources. Are you tracking where the database is in terms of what rights you're getting from there? You're double clicking something. What are you double clicking onto? Making sure that you understand that for the ultimate use of that data all the way down the road, that what you're clicking onto provides you that ability so that there aren't any broken lines. And the same way in terms of the not only research and commercial, but also the scope of rights, right? And Roger brought this up right off the top, is sometimes we think 6 inches in front of our face in terms of the primary use of data, but not what it could possibly be used for. And I know Roger has given presentations before on how you may be pulling in data to use for an interchangeable set of trained AI models. You may think you know what your data is going to be used for, but at the end of the day, you may want to use that data for 2 or 3 different models. Are you sure that you know that ahead of time when you were starting to pull in data into your moat? Sort of things like that. So a lot of it is about mapping the data, understanding what your strategy is going to be through the entire life cycle where that data can be used, and then executing your plan with that in mind. I think often people start executing on no plan and then start to piecemeal a plan later on, and that's where problems start, because it's hard to go back and get what you didn't have initially.
Right. I want to move on to a little bit about privacy and access next. So even just the title of today's special panel made me a little uncomfortable, like healthcare data commercialization, right? So is commercialization really the problem, or is it really more about how you go about sharing data with insufficient protections, and what are the risks that we're really concerned about? And Devin, I think I'd like you to open with some comments on that.
I don't think commercialization should be the issue, but I have to say that it is a little bit of it does create that kind of red flag reaction for people. There is this sort of don't sell my data. I've often heard stuff from patients, nothing about me without me, like include me in that. People know that the data business generates lots and lots of money for commercial data brokers. And I think for a number of patients who are sort of hyper aware of that environment and yet struggle to be able to pay for their own healthcare, struggle to get access to treatments for their research, for which sometimes happens with their data, like it all feels like a very unfair arrangement. And I think sometimes there's this sense that, because healthcare should be a right for people, that that when we stray into the commercialization of data, we have somehow tainted healthcare, and that, that's to be avoided, and that, essentially any advantages that come from medical discovery somehow ought to be done without any money changing hands. But I think that flies in the face of sort of the reality of how medical discovery happens, which very much is dependent on financial investment, access to data, and there isn't any reason why there shouldn't be a way for both patients and the holders and processors and curators of this data should not be able to kind of leverage what is essentially a marketplace that values discovery with money. So it's a little bit of to me, if you sort of really dive into what ought to be the concern, it shouldn't necessarily be commercialization, but a whole host of sort of concerns around, sort of our healthcare system in general, people's ability to access innovation, people's ability to benefit from innovation as opposed to the commercialization itself. But it does tend to put a black eye on things and is definitely tends to get a little bit more regulatory attention. You sometimes see legislative bills that basically you cannot commercialize this data kinds of approaches without sort of an appreciation that the commercial marketplace is often where the only place where discovery can happen, because you need capital in order to, to fund discovery. So at any rate, I think it shouldn't be about commercialization, but I would say oftentimes it is, but I think that part of the way that you address some of those fears is digging into what's underneath them and addressing them through some of the types of activities and practices that Kurt referenced earlier that I think are quite exemplary.
I think that's a good segue to Kurt. I think, in your opening statements, Kurt, you said rightfully so that we do not sell patient data. We can use it within the context of broader relationships and partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about how for external entities who don't have access to data to drive key innovation in the digital health space, what are ways, how can they structure appropriate partnerships with academic medical centers such as Cornell to gain access to the needed data to drive their innovations in a way that is beneficial for both parties?
Well, I think some of the others have already mentioned, I think one of the key ingredients is, can you use de-identified data? And if you can, then it's much easier to go into a relationship. The problem is that de-identification is relative. The law, the HIPAA law, creates rules about what is and is not an identified data set, and it has to do with dates and numbers and names and things like that. Nowadays, there's a lot of technology that makes it relatively easy to re-identify certain records which have been de-identified. So we have that problem. But it is definitely possible to do this, and we do it actually all the time. Now, there are certain parts of de-identification that's actually quite easy. If you just want a structured data set of labs and diagnoses, you can just strip out a lot of other information, and it's relatively easy to create a de-identified data set. Increasingly, though, we want a lot of information that's in notes or that contains dates. Okay, so if you're going to study infants, well, the difference between a 1-month-old and a 1-year-old is a very significant thing. And the law doesn't allow you to give those exact dates. We have a partnership with all the academic medical centers in New York City called Insight, where we have successfully shared the data between Cornell, Columbia, Sinai, NYU, Montefiore, and others. And we're even able to link the records in a de-identified way using this very sophisticated third party that does this encryption matching. And that works for the clinical and translational science centers across the country. We're part of a COVID collective that does this. And there's all the major academic medical centers in the country are doing this sort of things. You can also do things like what's called data obfuscation. So that's where you take an identifier and you change it to something that's similar, that doesn't change the meaning. So you change Mary to Sue and Bob to John. That can allow you to include certain kinds of information that is not semantically different. You do have to get careful because sometimes you might subtly change information. So for example, if you randomize a date, that works if the randomization is between someone who's 55 and 54, but it does not if they're 101 because that's such a distinctive number. The other thing that we can do is something called hiding in plain sight, where you do these kinds of switches and obfuscations, and you do it at a large scale. And then if you accidentally miss something, nobody knows which one is real and which one is fake. The problem with some of these technologies is that they work really well to fake out human beings, but they don't fake out computers. So we also have the problem that there's a lot of semantics in notes that are very subtle and difficult to mask. So if you say in the social history, the patient is the CEO of Citibank, that's hard to find. Or even if you say they live next to the CEO of Citibank, that's an identifier that's very difficult. Now, I'm working with a PhD student at Cornell Tech, Jack Morrison, and what he's doing is building what we call adversarial machines. So he has one machine that de-identifies the text, and then he has another machine that tries to re-identify it. And they duke it out until you get to a point where you can create a de-identified data set that we can put into to make available to researchers.
Great, thank you. Those are a lot of great techniques I think we can think about implementing. A follow-up question to that for you, Kurt. In 2019, the Mayo Clinic took the step of de-identifying 10 million structured patient records and 2.5 million unstructured portions to create the Mayo Clinic platform for the purposes of providing access to this clinical data to vetted third parties. But not many other academic medical centers have provided this level of access writ large to their data. So what are some of the challenges in providing that type of access, and what are some of sort of the reputational risks or the liabilities that might prevent another academic medical center from creating a similar sort of database?
Well, first of all, creating a database like this is hard. The Mayo did a lot of work to make that happen. That costs money. Somebody has to spend the money to do that. And there are institutions that are attempting to do it, but it is complicated. You also have to have a policy infrastructure that is already in place that allows you to do that. So if you are an institution that has had privacy policies in the past that are interpreted as not allowing that sort of thing, you might be able to change them prospectively, but it's a little more difficult to reach backwards to change your policy if that was what you said at the time that the patient came to you. And not all institutions were as academically forward-thinking as Mayo. That also gets into this notion of consents. There is this notion of broad or universal consent, and those words have specific meanings that I'm not implying when I say that. But how do you get a consent from a patient that allows you to use their specimens, their data over time as those uses evolve? The history of ethics in human research is that we generally consent people for a specific reason, and we tell them what we're going to do. And when you get into the data space and actually increase and certain kinds of advanced tissue analysis and things, we don't know what we're going to do yet. So there's a lot of discussion now about how institutions need to structure those processes, those consent processes, to make sure that patients understand the limits of what we might do with their information at a later date, knowing that we don't even know ourselves.
Kurt, maybe a follow-on question to that. I think we've been talking a little about structured data, unstructured data, and I realized maybe we didn't give a good overview to our audience. I know we circulated a glossary of terms, but can you talk a little bit about how, the differences between structured and unstructured, annotated, unannotated, and sort of the ease in which that's assembled from like an academic medical center?
Yeah, so at this point, essentially all academic medical centers have electronic medical records. So to some extent, all the data is structured in that it's in a database. But inside that database, the data has different levels of structure. So for example, a chemistry lab test or a hematology lab test, a complete blood count that shows your how many white blood cells you have, how many red blood cells, or how much potassium you have, or how much chloride is in your blood. Those things are all highly structured. Although actually it wasn't that long ago that even though they were structured, we didn't call them the same thing. Okay, so a complete blood count at one institution might be called something completely different at a different institution, or so how do you make a hemoglobin? Well, you tie it to terminologies. And the more terminologies and standards and structures that you add to the data, the richer that data set becomes. However, there is a lot of data that is either semi-structured or completely unstructured. So an example of a completely unstructured data set would be a physician note. And particularly in the more cognitive specialties, psychiatry, internal medicine, where the doctor may write about any subject having to do with that patient's health. Whereas, for example, in a procedure or an endoscopy, there might be a high degree of structure to what the doctor is likely to say at any given point. And so the data has different amounts of value depending on its structure and what you want to use it for.
Thank you. Maybe Roger and Jason, maybe I can turn to you on sort of the next question. So we've been focused a lot on, data from the hospital system or the EMR or patient records or going to the doctors, but there's a lot of other healthcare-esque data that consumers are generating through, their Fitbits or their Apple Watches. Is there a difference to privacy issues and regulatory matters, whether the data comes from a doctor's visit versus somebody's Fitbit and their app on their iPhone?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to tackle, one of the questions you raised earlier is about, whether commercialization of data is bad. I don't think it's bad, and not just primarily because I think people have to have a fundamental understanding for, like machine learning and AI. This is a very hot topic right now, right? Machine learning and AI is only as smart as the data that's fed into it. That's the part that folks have to really clearly understand. So there is actually, in order to generate very useful, inventions or insights in the healthcare space, you need a lot of data that's of high quality, right? Some of those issues Curtis already touched on. There's a difference between structured and unstructured data sets, right? There's other things that are more legal related, that whether or not you have rights to the same level of rights to that data that you're trying to, combine together to go ahead and train a particular AI algorithm with. So I do think a couple things will be very helpful from my perspective. One is the state of standardization that Curtis mentioned. Without really kind of like more a very pervasive standardization throughout the industry, EMRs are very difficult to go and combine effectively, right? I think also, from perspective of how this data is being used, now it's gone beyond just doctor's visits. Data, for example, that's being captured on your home devices, your Amazon Echoes, your Amazon, they're being used in different ways. There is actually innovation that we've heard of. Jason could probably say a few more of this, but that involves tracking, because there's just aspects of these devices that we have at home that tracks a lot more things than we actually know about. For example, some of these devices have sensors that can tell which part of the room that the individual is lingering in, as part of their normal daily activities. And you generally think, well, why would that be useful? Well, that type of pattern is useful for diagnosing a lot of different conditions, right? So that's the thing surprising about this space, is that data has been captured in a lot of different areas. It's been captured in your car, in your home devices, in the wearables, and it's all being fed into a lot of these very complex algorithms in the healthcare space to diagnose and help treat a lot of conditions. So very interesting situations there.
Yeah, and I would add that as technologies emerge in the digital health precision medicine space, it's a race to create the most unique sort of multimodal analytical engine. Everybody's trying to grab different unique sets of data, images, this set of data, that set of, IoT this, wearables this, what combination is uniquely mine. And as a result, what happens is you're not pulling from just sort of one type of data and analyzing in within your four walls of your company. You're pulling from all different sources. So Lisa, what happens is the amount of pre-work and planning that's necessary to execute on a lot of these emerging technologies is growing, because you're being involved with so many more entities. And so ensuring that your data map is in place, ensuring that you're asking the right questions to those that you're grabbing data from, or those you're sending data out to, and making sure you've mapped that and tracked that, and make sure those agreements are all with a common thread and philosophy is something that's going to even be more important the more different sets of data you're cooking into your AI, because that's really the race now. Everyone's training an AI model nowadays, but what data is going into it, what combinations of data are going into it to generate unique insights.
Devin, can you follow up on that, on some of the how consumers and individual patients can actually access their data that's being kind of put out there into these Internet of Things and connectables and wearables?
I actually think it's a bit of a challenge for patients to be able to access their data in wearables and consumer-facing tools and applications, because that space isn't covered by HIPAA, and HIPAA provides patients with a right to be able to access their data from a clinical medical site, most of them, or a claims record from a health plan. And, from any of the vendors that they're using that are HIPAA business associates, you might not be able to get it directly from the business associate, but you still have a right to that data. But you don't have those rights in the context of this commercial space. So I think that's another thing that sort of irks a lot of patients who, are sort of very interested in gaining greater insight from the data that's being generated out of devices and implantables and wearables, and they often can't get access to that data. I, was working at one point with a number of pacemaker patients who had the pacemakers installed in a medical facility, but the company that produces those pacemakers and monitors the data coming off of those pacemakers is not necessarily covered by HIPAA, and they wanted to see that data so they could get a greater understanding of what they were essentially feeling in their own bodies about fluctuations in their heart rates from basic activities that they were conducting throughout their daily lives, and yet they were not given access to that data. So it's one of those spaces where it becomes a pain point for patients. And again, when you talk about what bothers people about commercialization, it's, people are making money off of this data. It's coming out of me or things that I'm inputting, and I don't have any visibility into it whatsoever. It can be incredibly frustrating for people.
Great, thank you. We had a few questions from registrants, and that I guess one of the related ones was a question, and we can ask this to all the panelists, but should patients profit from their data? I guess, Devin, you were kind of touching upon that a little bit. At least what is a driver of friction from patients or consumers and how their data might be used? So I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think of it as almost like compensation for a combination of effort and risk, right? Because even when you de-identify patient data, you haven't de-risked it to zero risk of re-identification. You've taken it down to the regulatorily acceptable level of very low risk, but you haven't necessarily completely de-risked it, and yet you're sort of asking patients to sort of, or not asking them, and instead just creating vehicles for data access and use for which they, often don't have very much visibility, and which is, might be generating revenue, while not necessarily a sale, but might be generating some revenue for an institution. So our view is that patients should share in that value in some way, shape, or form. I think, these conversations are taking place across the ecosystem at a myriad of levels. There are some people who are basically setting up companies that allegedly allow patients to profit from their data. Others think of the return of value in the form of enhancements to medical care, or ability to attend conferences, or contributions to patient advocacy organizations. I mean, I've seen lots of different permutations of this, but I think from a kind of long-term view of the data ecosystem that we're trying to create, that is trusted and that functions well and that powers precision medicine, like we can't leave patients out of that equation and just assume that because we've de-identified their data, it's all okay.
Roger and Jason, given your kind of position and seeing kind of deals that are happening and sort of in this space, are there any trends in sort of the marketplace in general that either have benchmarked the value of data or health records, or any kind of commercialization trends that you've been seeing?
I don't know if there's anything that I could, talk to in terms of like a benchmark value for data sets, right? It's really difficult to, it's really dependent on the type of data and what information it's available. So there's no, what's valuable to one person is not, one entity is not as valuable to others, depending on what they're doing, right? So that's the first piece of that. But in terms of, what we are seeing on trends wise is there are definite, companies are just really in the last 2 to 3 years caught up to this regulatory risk, right? It's really interesting how that's kind of creeped up, because again, it's creeped up from perspective primarily on the right side. And it's interesting that before, when this, what happens typically, right, is let's say you're a large pharma company, right? And I won't name any one in particular, but generally speaking, you want data from you, especially if you're doing in the oncology space, where you want data from a lot of different sources, because you need, again, the high volume quality data. And what had not been done, I would say as well, 2 to 3 years ago, was that they were not really auditing those data sets beyond at the agreement level, right? So in other words, they're using a lot of these indemnification clauses and other type of, I guess, contractual means of ensuring in their minds that the data is compliant, right? But as we're seeing, and with some of the things that are happening in the FTC and this disgorgement, some of these disgorgement actions, that's not enough. There has to be a little bit more of, I would say, of auditing and looking a little more upstream and evaluating this, your suppliers for their compliance with getting this data, obtaining this data from patients in the first place. So we're definitely seeing a much higher level of sophistication that's going, not just doing audits, not just looking at the agreement itself that's on the transactions, but doing these audits of where this data source is coming from.
So in some respects, you would say a value driver there is I'm going to call it a de-risked data set that has.
That's exactly right. What's interesting is that, we're Jason and I are patent attorneys really by trade. That's how we grew up our careers, but we've dealt with data probably very intensive in the last 6 or 7 years. Interestingly, when companies acquire other companies, they invariably do IP diligence. They always make sure that the patent rights, are, especially in the technology space, are secured. What they haven't done until recently is they haven't done, especially for data science companies, where basically the values, these algorithms that have been generated from taking this data set from disparate sources, they haven't done the de-risking and the diligence on the data side. And that's something I think in the coming years, that's going to be a huge area of focus. They're going to get, especially if you're a diagnostic company that's being acquired, and your diagnosis is based on, again, data that's feeding your AI algorithms are making these predictions. If you're not doing that level of diligence to make sure that all the data that's included in those algorithms are compliant, it's the same type of risk that you run as if you bought a company that didn't have IP or had an FTO issue.
Yeah, and this extends to the investor community as well. The investor community, the VCs, angel investors, they're not doing the same. They're not doing this diligence as well. And so often a lot of these companies spring out of university, spring out of research centers, spring out of insights you've generated inside of the four walls, such as Cornell, which is why it's so important for the company itself to be proactive, because eventually it will be discovered. And when that happens, the later it happens down the road, the more difficult it will be to repair. And so that's why it really does start from the infancy stages of any company or any new business within a large company. This is the same idea, is once you decide to go down this road in terms of developing commercial products, the strategy needs to be set immediately and then executed from day one.
Great. So I'd like to take some of the time to address some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A from our audience today. Maybe I'll start with you, Kurt. We have a question from a doctor who is interested in how you can build trust with patients who feel that they have no control over their data. So how can an individual doctor who's not really controlling what happens to an individual patient's data when it enters into an EMR system build sort of that trust? And maybe Devin, you can follow Kurt on that.
Well, I think at as a clinician myself, I think my inclination would be to start by finding out what it is that's driving their fear. Because that's probably the most important thing. What are they worried about in terms of the utilization of their data? Is there something that's happened to them that is in their record that they're embarrassed about? Are they trying to get life insurance and they're afraid they're not going to be able to do it? Is there something that they don't want their family to know? Are they worried they're going to lose their job? I mean, you need to uncover what the fear is, and then talk to them about, what the mechanisms are that we have in place that protect them. But it's also going to be important to help them understand how we cannot protect them. And I think one of the biggest problems that we face in the healthcare data ecosystem is that we follow a bunch of laws and regulations and principles within healthcare entities, so-called covered entities, that the rest of the world doesn't pay any attention to whatsoever. And, I feel like in many instances, we get very precious inside academic medical centers about trying to protect privacy in these very abstract and esoteric ways. And then the patient goes out into the real world and all of those privacy protections disappear. The insurance company, the transactions are flowing through a clearinghouse. They're selling the data. It goes to the insurance company, which, by the way, also owns a pharmaceutical company and a bunch of other companies. And they're using the data in particular ways and selling it. And then you go to the pharmacy and you buy your prescription and you pay it with a credit card, and Visa and MasterCard now have your data and they're going to use it in a particular way. And maybe you store it inside your Google Android phone, and now Google has access to your data. And we've done all of this stuff inside the healthcare environment to protect the privacy of the patient, and the information is known to the world anyway. For example, I mean, one thing that's in the news right now is that if you go to a website, let's say you go and let's say it's a healthcare website, you don't identify yourself. You just go to the website and you search for a healthcare term. You search for lymphoma. Well, there's a whole bunch of companies that are tracking your movements on the web, and they know a lot about you, and they're able to buy data about you, even if they don't have it. Facebook knows everything about you. Google knows everything about you. And so even though you never told anybody anything other than your search term, now they know a whole bunch of information about you. So you need to talk to patients about their concerns and help them understand what we can do to protect them, but then what they need to understand about how they need to protect themselves if they're really concerned, using anonymous browsers and things like that, if it really is a big issue, and what it is that they realistically can and cannot control.
Yeah, it's hard to, I can't improve on that answer. It's an excellent one. And in a circumstance where you have a physician that may not be as cognizant of the legal environment as Kurt clearly is, sometimes getting some help from your the privacy officer, if you're working within an institution, can sometimes be helpful in having those conversations with patients. But I also think it points us in a policy direction that I think not necessarily something that you would talk to patients about, but I think it's important to sort of remember again with this goal towards creating this trusted ecosystem is what people are concerned about is when their data is used against them. Right. I mean, we do have this sort of creep out factor with people being sort of trolled or surveilled on the web and not really being able to privately search for things without getting ads surfaced in your search engine all the time in ways that tend to creep people out and cut down on what should be natural behaviors of taking advantage of an internet ecosystem to find information and be linked to things that could help them. But if we did a better job, frankly, at shutting down the way that data can be used and weaponized against people, such as denials for life insurance, denials for disability insurance, potential depending on the type of data, employment uses. We've kind of closed the health insurance discrimination pieces with the Affordable Care Act, but for a while that law, whether it was going to continue and all those provisions were going to stay in place was uncertain. Maybe all of that will come back again. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about in a really detailed way about how to cabin and data uses in order to allow some things and not other things without necessarily thinking of the bigger picture. If we just foreclosed the way that data gets used to hurt people or populations of people, we actually could create advantages in the data ecosystem that we don't have today, potentially. But I completely agree with Kurt in terms of the type of conversation that is helpful to have with patients.
Great. So I have 3 interrelated questions in the Q&A that all tie back to the sort of the discussion we had on whether patients should profit from their data or how you can do that. You know, so one kind of comment or question is oftentimes in clinical trials, patients are sometimes given a gift card for participating or some money. At the end of the day, the company is using their data for purposes of, you know, clinical validation of their product or their service. So how is that sort of different than paying a patient for their data? And then kind of related, you know, can you give examples where they are compensated for the data? What's the pros and the cons? And sort of the last comment or question that came in is, can you touch upon the equity piece of paying patients for the data? Do you run the risk of somebody participating or giving data when they don't really want to because they're economically disadvantaged and they need the money? And how do you kind of balance rewarding patients for sharing this kind of information without sort of, you know, disadvantaging people who may not want to give their data but are being felt forced or compelled to do so? So I'll just open that up to anybody on the panel who has thoughts or comments on those 3 topics.
I mean, I have lots of thoughts there, but I'll be quick so that I'm not the only one contributing, because since I've contributed on this question earlier, already, you know, the pharma contributions to patients for research participation are typically geared towards effort. So the time you spend, the time it takes for you to come to the trial, the time it takes for you to fill out a patient-reported outcome survey. But there has been less thought given to how you compensate patients, again, for assuming some of the risks that are inherent in providing their data, or just recognizing that they should be part of that value proposition. There's been a lot less thinking in that regard. You know, again, we do it on our citizen platform. We return a portion of some of the commercial license for data that they have consented to share for research purposes when there is a licensing fee that is provided for that data from the citizen platform. We are not the only ones doing it, but I don't think that very many people are, just by way of example. And in terms of the ethics, since somebody else has jumped in, you do have to be careful not to set that compensation level to the point where you're luring people into something, particularly if what you're luring them into is not a good idea for them. I think some of those ethical concerns get addressed when you're not luring them into a bad deal, right? You are compensating them for a type of data sharing that is intended to benefit medicine, has been vetted for whether it's ethical, does involve de-identified data. So you're not sort of asking them to necessarily to do something that would be against their best interest to do, but you do have to be very careful, I think, about the level at which you set that so that you're not creating perverse incentives for people to take a step that they shouldn't really take in order to get the money.
You know,
Go ahead.
I mean, I agree with everything Devin just said. I want to add that, you know, we just have a lot of convoluted processes and structures in this country because we have a really stupid healthcare system, and we never really want to deal with that as the problem. So healthcare is not a right in the United States. Health insurance is not universal. And it's ridiculously expensive. Outcomes are terrible. And we know all of that. And that is the fundamental problem that clouds pretty much everything that we talk about in healthcare and research space. So right now, you know, one of the common things is you've got a terrible cancer. Your insurance company is not going to pay for a genetic test that might identify a gene that would allow you to go on an experimental protocol that might save your life. And a company which makes that test or makes the drug is willing to give you the test for free. And now inside an academic medical center, that's more likely to go through a research protocol or some kind of informed consent process. But out in the real world, that's not what happens. The doctor presents the patient and says, I can do this test for free. They may not even, the patient may not even be aware of the fact that their data is essentially being sold in return for a free test. And you can have endless arguments about how to tighten up that process and how to, make it more ethical. But the fundamental problem is that we don't have adequate healthcare insurance in the country. And I think we need to, I think creating complex ethical schemes and complex legal schemes is necessary in the context that we live in, but it also is an enabler of the country not facing up to what is the more fundamental problem.
I'm going to piggyback off some of the things that Curtis and Devin had touched on. The first thing I'm going to say is I don't think it's unethical at all for patients to benefit out of the use of the data. I think that's absolutely something that's necessary. However, the infrastructure to do something like that doesn't exist, right? I mean, what I mean by that is right now, what some of the things that Curtis and Devin are talking about. I mean, you can incentivize on a point-to-point basis, meaning like, here, I'm trying to get this test from company A, and I go ahead and consent for my use of my data in exchange for, the use of that test from company A. What doesn't exist, especially in the genetics realm, is that, for example, whole genome sequencing. You get one. Generally speaking, your whole genome doesn't really change that dramatically over time, right? So you get one full. Let's say you go through one full test, whole genome test, right? And you want to go ahead and there isn't an infrastructure that's available for you to say, look, here's my data, my whole genome data. Here is also maybe the attachment of some EMRs that again give context to this whole genome data. I have a selection of different parties, but I would like to transact with, and I want to be compensated in some way, shape, or form. That type of infrastructure doesn't exist, at least not currently, right? If you really want to get compensated, that infrastructure is what you need. If you have that infrastructure in place, that really is power for a patient to go, or for an individual to opt in and opt out. Maybe it's a few dollars for every test that or every company that you send your data to. But if you go through hundreds of different companies that you're making available to, you see if that infrastructure existed, you can actually monetize off of it, right? In a very effective way. But that doesn't exist right now, infrastructure-wise.
Yeah, and I'll just one real quick statement. There needs to be a balance of what value or profiting means, because there's a financial profiting, which is going to take time to get, and it's going to delay the actual profit in new treatments and better treatments, which are delayed innovation. So it's the balance of delayed innovation versus financial profiting that needs to be balanced. And I think that reaching that balance is going to be very difficult, which is why, at the end of the day, I think we still tend to side to how quickly can we advance treatment development and new drug development. I think still is the priority now, but absolutely with an eye to balancing individual patients profiting fairly.
There are people like Jaron Lanier have written a lot about how to build that infrastructure. Technically it would be possible, this construct around micropayments and stuff. I don't think it's going to happen, that's a problem that's way bigger than medicine.
Yeah, it's difficult. It is, and there's a lot of commercial genetics companies that are commercial genetics companies that have tried different versions of that, frankly, right? But that is the ultimate way, right? If you want to say allowing you to control and monetize, on a microtransaction type of basis.
Well, I think with that, we are a bit over time. I appreciate all of the panelists' conversation. I'll ask everyone to provide, one parting word. What is the one takeaway that you would like our audience to know about today? So, Kurt, I will start with you.
Well, to me, I think the big challenge before us is to try to get, government, which is really the only entity that can really intervene here, to level the playing field between healthcare companies and non-healthcare companies. That inequity in the regulatory world, I think, is creating a lot of the complexity here. And it would really help if the large companies that are keeping and storing and using all of this data had similar responsibilities to protect and use the data ethically that healthcare companies did. I think that would unlock a lot of potential for us to use healthcare data for good.
Devin?
It's great comments from Kurt. As usual, I do think that a more fair policy environment that protects the data regardless of where it sits and who uses it is important. But I also really like, it could be a while before we get that. And in the meantime, we'll have this cacophony of state laws that are popping up like at a whack-a-mole level. So the best practices kinds of things like the one Kurt mentioned at the top of this webinar are really kind of essential. If we move the community towards better behavior, we'll be much better positioned to succeed, number one, to be trusted, number two, and to be really prepared for when we get federal legislation.
Roger.
I have a very hopeful thought about this, right? I think the era of this wild west approach of how healthcare data is being transacted is coming to an end, right? Because there's a lot of shine right now over AI and machine learning in general, and specifically towards some of the recent developments in ChatGPT and the like. It's beginning to really start rile up the legislative community, both on the federal level as well as the state level. So I do believe a lot of those protections are going to start rolling across in the coming years, and we're moving in the right direction.
Last but not least, Jason.
Thank you. Plan, strategy, I think is essential. I'll analogize it to IP, what we do for a living. We've always said, Roger and I, don't file for file's sake, file for a reason. Know why you're doing what you're doing. It's the same thing with data transactions. Investors aren't going to be impressed because you have a raw number of data transactions. If they were all constructed wrong, everybody's going to end up paying the price down the road. So the key here is to plan a data strategy, plan an IP strategy. So surround yourself, and these are interrelated. IP is part of your data transactions. These things they're never going to leave each other's side. So surround yourself with sophisticated support to be able to help you plan and strategize appropriately.
Great. So thank you also to all of our attendees who stayed with us. This was clearly an engaging topic, and we probably could keep talking for quite a while longer. I know there were some questions we didn't get to. We will try to follow up with those via email to the extent that we're able to. Again, we host lots of programming and educational events, both through CTL as well as Enterprise Innovation. So please check out our events calendar for future events. Please also, if you have particular topics of interest that you're interested in learning about or interested in having dialogue about, let us know. We're always looking to curate and put together novel content that's really meeting the needs of our stakeholders. So thank you very much for your time today. And I hope everybody came away learning a little bit of something, or at least having something new to think about that they hadn't thought about before. So thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.